Thank you, Eduardo, and I particularly want to thank Eduardo personally for the invitation to speak here. It's with great pleasure that I speak on this occasion. I received the invitation to speak here with a thrill because of the nature of the occasion, a discussion of and celebration of Henry David Thoreau on the 200th anniversary of his birth. The idea that this celebration was being organized here in Porto Alegre, Brazil, was particularly enthralling. Brazil, to me, represents one of the lines of the future. And I found that like your country, like mine, has many problems. I realize that. Mine, perhaps more problems. But it is still the case that I think Thoreau can be a part of the future of both of our nations. His environmental awareness, his political independence, his moral integrity provide useful models for us all. His determination to live philosophically, to reflect critically on how he pursued his life, to find what are the necessaries of human life, can still be an inspiration. Thoreau is certainly best known for his masterpiece, Walden, who he wrote many essays, other nature writing, poetry. Let me describe what I shall be doing in this talk. I want to begin with an account of my own relationship to Thoreau's texts. This will involve a little bit of personal history about my philosophical education, and especially about one of my teachers, the philosopher Stanley Cavell. This involvement with Thoreau led my being asked relatively recently to contribute an essay to a volume entitled Thoreau's Importance for Philosophy. Reflecting on that title, I realized I wanted to say more about the historical, philosophical, and scientific setting of Thoreau's work. The pioneering work here, of course, was Cavell's in the Census of Walden, but he was interpreting a text in order to show that what it was actually about was not necessarily what was being read from it. At any rate, I thought that I could say a bit more about the intellectual setting of Walden and place it amongst other 19th century texts produced in that same intellectual setting. Thoreau has always been of great importance in American studies. That's a common program in American universities and a pretty well established one. And I don't intend to deny his role in the development of American thought. He established, or reestablished, in fact, the genre of nature writing. He participated in the literary culture centered on Concord, responded to the political history of his age, and so on. I mean, all of that is fine. But until Cavell's book, he was not a part of any philosophy curriculum in the United States. It's kind of interesting. It's partly because of the history of the development of academic philosophy in the United States, and more generally in the English-speaking world. Though some philosophers were committed to certain historical there were schools of philosophy which were influenced by European schools. One thinks of the St. Louis Hegelians, and the development in general was in the direction of what eventually became analytical philosophy. In the United States, this method included pragmatism, especially with Peirce, Dewey, and James. James had been inspired by Emerson, but this did not lead to Emerson's becoming a part of the philosophy curriculum. So the academic organization of knowledge is ultimately unimportant with where we study texts and where they show up, but it does signify the context in which we consider the meaning of a work. So I want to attempt to identify both the philosophical setting of Thoreau's work and to consider its relationship to science, the science of his day, in particular to the development of biology. I hope the philosophical setting is not too unfamiliar to you, since I obviously cannot give a detailed account, for example, of the philosophies of Kant and Hegel, but I think it's important because Thoreau himself uses the term transcendental to characterize a way of thought that was crucial to him. And I will ask the question too, was Thoreau a transcendentalist? Okay. I'll also investigate Thoreau's conception of evolutionary biology as a clue to what he understands human beings to be. His naturalism, I believe, can be a model for us for understanding what of science constitutes cultural belief, rational belief, and what is not settled by science. And finally, I want to comment on his most important essay, Civil Disobedience, or Resistance to Civil Government. It influenced figures like Tolstoy and Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I want to consider its setting and to connect its argument to what Stanley Cavell has called Emersonian perfectionism. It forms a piece, I believe, with Thoreau's themes in Walden, in which he works out his own version of perfectionism. So first I'm going to start a little bit with my personal history with Thoreau. The major facts of Thoreau's life can be stated quite briefly. You've heard most of this already. He was born 200 years ago in 1817 in Concord, Massachusetts. He attended local schools. He went to Harvard from 1833 to 1837. He then returned to Concord, where he lived the rest of his life, though he did do a fair amount of traveling. After his return to Concord, his life was entwined with that of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who recommended that he keep a journal. Emerson was already involved in a small, enthusiastic group of intellectuals called the Transcendental Club, and Thoreau became a part of that circle. He built a cabin on Walden Pond. He spent 2 years there. He earned his living by teaching, by working in his family's pencil business, and by surveying. He was above all a reader and a writer, most famously of Walden, an account of his time in the woods, highly structured account, carefully constructed, and of many other texts and poems. He died in 1862. That will seem a long time ago to most of you. I actually had a grandfather who was born 4 years before Thoreau died, so it doesn't seem that far back to me. I'm not a scholar of Thoreau, but a kind of passionate amateur of his text. I grew up in California, but I've lived in New England most of my life, 50 years at least in New England. My younger daughter lives about 5 miles from Walden Pond. I visited there often. I've hiked the White Mountains in New Hampshire. All of these things sort of we have a predilection to be interested in Thoreau. I first read Walden about 60 years ago in my first year in university. Thoreau spoke to me then, as he does still to so many adolescents, because his passionate inquiry into the conditions of his own life. This became somewhat obscured by the detailed description of the natural setting at Walden Pond, and Thoreau seemed to many people to naturally fall into the category of nature writer. His marvelous descriptions of the natural settings at Walden Pond, on Cape Cod, in New Hampshire, on the Merrimack River, and so on, tend to dominate one's memory of reading his texts. I remember My first reading of Walden seemed relatively clear, although there were some passages that presented puzzles, but it was the account of this young man who built a cabin in the woods near Walden Pond with a detailed accounting of his expenses and then a description of various aspects of his life and surroundings, including the setting of the pond and planting a field of beans and his relations with his neighbors and witnessing the impact of the new railroad and the progress of the season and his giving up of that life. Like many young readers, when I had finished a classic, I didn't anticipate a need to reread and reconsider it. When I was in graduate school at Harvard University in my first year, there was great excitement among some of the graduate students over the arrival of a young philosopher who had been a junior fellow in the Society of Fellows there and then gone on to Berkeley, his undergraduate institution, to teach philosophy and to complete his dissertation. Truth to tell, his dissertation was already legendary. He had published a number of articles, but two of them had been bombshells for the young men and women beginning their careers in philosophy. I'm referring, of course, to Stanley Cavell, and the articles were Must We Mean What We Say and the Availability of Wittgenstein's Later Philosophy. Now, over 50 years later, of course, there are established bodies of secondary literature about Austin and Wittgenstein, so on. That was not the case in 1963. Wittgenstein's philosophical investigation had first been published a decade earlier, though something of his later philosophy had been known since the 1930s from the reports and notes of students. I still recall the excitement that I felt when I first encountered the availability. When I was at Oxford, I remember that it had been recommended to me by Lloyd Reinhardt, who had studied with Cavell at Berkeley. For the first time, I felt that I had a sense of what Wittgenstein's later philosophy might mean and what it might mean to me. When I returned to graduate study in philosophy at Harvard, Stanley Cavell was also beginning his teaching career then. I attended all of the courses that he gave during my 3 years in Cambridge, and I, along with a group of other graduate students, became students of Cavell, students in a stronger sense than we were students of other faculty, though I also was a student of John Rawls in that stronger sense. They provided me with examples of philosophical thinking and style, very, very different from each other, that were usable in a way that Quine and White and Goodman and so on did not, much as I admired many things about them. When I'd been teaching for a few years at the University of Chicago, I heard the news that Stanley Cavell had written a book on Thoreau. I was astonished. I knew that his readings of Austin and Wittgenstein emphasized a heavy emphasis on the idea of the ordinary. He himself had said he found that idea of the ordinary in Thoreau and later in Emerson. At any rate, it led me back to Walden, and indeed actually to Walden Pond. By that time, I had immersed myself in the history of philosophy, and I began to see why Cavell had taken up Thoreau. So I'm now going to turn to a broader view of the history of philosophy, European philosophy, up to more or less those first decades of the 19th century, to see the intellectual setting of Thoreau's work. I want to approach the background of Thoreau's writing in two different ways, from within the history of philosophy and the American reception of European philosophy, and from the perspective of biology and science more generally. I hope to justify this double approach and to relate these two accounts by showing their interconnection. By the time Thoreau was an undergraduate at Harvard, there had been roughly 200 plus years of the development of both modern philosophy and modern science. Though that's not surprising, that's what defines both modern philosophy and modern science, is their separation from each other. The idea of modern philosophy, whether in Descartes or Bacon or Hobbes or whoever you do it, is that you get an explanatory structure that does not involve authority, that does not involve faith. Once that happens, science can, as it were, be pursued. This is not the claim that immediately in the 17th century that those philosophers gave up on religion or quit believing or anything remotely like that. It just means that science got free. And the question then was going to be, what do we make of it? What does it tell us about ourselves in the world? So the developments of modern philosophy and modern science were, of course, intimately intertwined. Modern philosophy developed from multiple sources, from the Protestant Reformation, from the revival of ancient skepticism, from the renewed interest in ancient atomism, but is also marked by the separation of philosophy from theology, partly because of the development of what we now identify as modern science. Science separated itself from philosophy. It was still called natural philosophy in England in the 17th century. And whether one identifies Bacon or Hobbes or Descartes as the beginning of modernity, that beginning occurred in the first half of the 17th century. I'll return later to trace some developments in the history of science and, of course, in the history of the understanding of science's significance. Philosophers are now pretty much used to a narrative of the history of 17th and 18th century European philosophy as a development of two traditions, the empiricist one of Locke, Berkeley, Hume, the rationalist one of Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. This narrative was invented by Kant. It's now often been criticized for ignoring various aspects of both traditions and ignoring thinkers who don't fit easily into either. I don't want to pursue those criticisms, but to understand what the influence of Kant's reading of the history of philosophy and of Hegel's response to that reading was in both Europe and the United States. Kant famously, in the Critique of Pure Reason, declared that he had limited reason in order to make room for faith. He based his argument on the distinction between things as they appear to us, the empirical or the phenomenal, and things as they are in themselves, the transcendental or noumenal. I won't go through any of his arguments, but I do want to note that for Kant, this distinction is both epistemological, about what can be known, and by implication, ontological, about the nature of the things on either side of this divide. Science has the responsibility for knowledge. Our awareness of the moral law is the basis of our belief or faith in what lies beyond the boundary of possible experience. Kant's philosophy, critical philosophy in the Critique of Pure Reason, is based entirely on this understanding of the transcendental, what lies beyond the scope of reason. It is this distinction which enables him to sort out what the empiricists had right and wrong, what the rationalists had right and wrong, and it's this distinction which allows him to reconcile science and religion. Hegel develops in a variety of texts a critique of Kant's critical philosophy. His critique of the thing in itself, the concept of the thing in itself, is particularly devastating. His claim is that the very conception of thing in itself is necessarily empty. According to Kant's own account of the relationship of concepts to experience, both a priori concepts, which the human being brings to experience, and the a posterior or empirical concepts, there's no way there could be any content to a concept of the thing in itself. I'm not going to go into the transcendental dialectic. Kant does try to develop an argument to show that there's a way to make sense out of that, and it's a fascinating argument, and it in fact had a great influence on Peirce, but it's sort of irrelevant here. Hegel instead historicizes the whole conceptual structure in terms of what we understand the world, in terms of which we understand the world ourselves. Hegel's version of the transcendental empirical distinction is the constantly changing state of Geist, his term for the structural self-understanding of human beings. There is, of course, at every stage of history a distinction between how Geist understands itself. Falling short of true self-understanding is alienation, and how it will have understood itself, how it will later understand itself. So there's no ontological or epistemological barrier to transcending our current level of self-understanding. Hegel, however, goes a step further, perhaps a bridge too far. He thinks that this historical process has a goal, the achievement of a complete self-understanding by Geist, and furthermore that this goal has been reached in his own philosophy. Hence, he necessarily thinks that history has ended. This would correspond in Marx's materialist revision of Hegel's account to the as yet unachieved state of true communism, a state notoriously underdescribed by Marx. Now, I've gone over briefly these chapters of German philosophy because I believe they set the agenda for many of the most radical 19th century philosophers and thinkers. And I would include here Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, Peirce, James. When I write set the agenda, I do not mean that the views of Kant and Hegel were widely accepted by any of these philosophers. Rather, they wrestled with what could be salvaged from their rejections. No one in the group accepted Kant's version of the transcendental empirical distinction. Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard did have different versions of this distinction, but no one accepted Hegel's account of history, though Marx, at least in his early works, did convert it into his own dialectical materialism by standing Hegel on his feet, as he said. German idealism and figures like Fichte and Schelling took a different path, albeit with its own version of the transcendental empirical distinction. Interestingly, both Kant and Hegel thought that their philosophies were final. And if they had been correct, that the doctrines that they proposed would have ended philosophy. No one who continued to philosophize could therefore actually accept either of their views. Kierkegaard makes great sport in the concluding unscientific postscript of the academic Hegelians who claim to be finishing the system. The dilemma for subsequent philosophers occurred because Kant himself seemed to violate his own strictures about the boundaries of knowledge, while Hegel seemed unable to justify the claim that he had achieved the complete self-understanding of Geist by anything other than a barefaced assertion. So where do these issues enter the American intellectual history? Well, there were examples of events of local interest in 17th, 18th century American thought. The dominant academic philosophy was a version of Lockean empiricism, the denial of innate ideas and the idea of the mind as a tabula rasa. There were vigorous disputes in religion about issues like free will versus predestination or the ontological status of Jesus. There was the very practical development of political thought and argument based on Locke, Hutcheson, Hume, Montesquieu, other Enlightenment thinkers, which occupied the Founding Fathers generation. But there wasn't much from a European perspective that counted as original philosophy. The situation in New England was rather peculiar. A great many of the original settlers in the United States had been Calvinist. They came for religious freedom, but it was religious freedom for themselves that interested them. They were perfectly happy to form communities that denied religious freedom to those who held different views from the majority. Once the first century and a half, or over this first century and a half of the settlement of the American colonies, religious views evolved, and the old-time religion, with its Calvinist version of double predestination and infant damnation, became less attractive. Double predestination, I'm sure you understand what that involved, essentially, that where you were headed for heaven or hell was determined before you were born. Infant damnation, as a deduction from that, was if you had a little baby that died and had seemed to live a perfectly blameless life, it might be going to hell for eternal suffering. Those are hard doctrines to sell, hard especially in America. So the Enlightenment version of religious belief kind of began to permeate Harvard Divinity School, which became the center of this new rationalized Christianity, that is Unitarianism. Like many of the advanced critical movements in political or religious thought, Unitarianism found it unable to draw a boundary of orthodoxy once it had challenged so many aspects of previous orthodoxy. And this is where our story begins. The story of Thoreau and the interpretation of Thoreau must begin with Emerson. Emerson, of course, came from a family of Unitarian clergy, himself became a Unitarian minister, resigned from his church over the issue of the administration of the Lord's Supper, the communion. After the death of his young first wife, he traveled to Europe and then reinvented himself and invented a new vocation of public lecturer, writer, sage. He was at the center of a group of young intellectuals, mostly former or current Unitarian ministers, who joined a discussion that they called the Transcendental Club, named in honor of recent developments in German philosophy that had just become available in the United States. The path of transmission was fairly clear. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who had spent some years in Germany, had written a book published in 1825, Aids to Reflection, that had conveyed his understanding of German philosophical terminology and philosophical theories. And indeed, he had published what were in fact translations into English of the work of several philosophers, including Schlegel, without attribution, albeit at a time when the concept of plagiarism had not been fully developed. An American philosopher, James Marsh, who was then president of the University of Vermont, published an edition of Coleridge's book in 1829 in the United States. He included in the edition a lengthy introduction in which he attempted to systematize the various elements of Coleridge's speculations. And it was this introduction which was the main source of the Transcendental Club's knowledge of German philosophy, though at least one of its members, Frederick Hedge, actually did know German and was able to read the German texts. Part of the reason that these early thinkers have not been of much interest to philosophers is because of this tangled line of transmission. For example, Emerson's use of the term reason and understanding seems to be totally at odds with Kant's use of the distinction. And it becomes it's difficult in a way to talk about directly influence or understanding when you have this sort of step connection to the tradition. The connection between Emerson and Thoreau is well known. When Thoreau returned to Concord after graduating from Harvard, he almost immediately became a kind of protege of Emerson's. Relationship eventually became one in which Thoreau joined the Emerson household as a kind of factotum and tutor to the Emerson children. The relationship was above all intellectual and inspirational. Emerson both encouraged him to keep the journal, drew him into the publication project of the journal, which didn't last long, but the Transcendentalist, the journal of the movement, which published the first of Thoreau's writings. I'll return to Emerson and Thoreau a bit later. Now, I started with some remarks about the relationship between the history of philosophy and the history of science. Let me now return to that relationship in the 17th and 18th century. The central figure, of course, was Newton. The exemplary character of Newton's successful synthesis of Galilean mechanics and Copernican astronomy was crucial. It defined for many, perhaps most, what a successful scientific theory could and would do. We're going to leave aside the fascinating question of what Newton's interpretation of his own theory's relationship to religion was. For many, it was the agenda of reconciling the new science with religion, particularly the connection with historical religion, particularly with historical Christianity. The Catholic Church had already resisted the new science at the trial of Galileo and continued to resist for many years. The new science seemed to raise the possibility that every physical state of the universe was completely determined by a prior physical state, a doctrine that I shall call scientism, fully formulated by Laplace in the 19th century. this doctrine carries with it the presumption of reductionism, that chemistry can be reduced to physics, perhaps that biology can be reduced to chemistry, so that there is no world beyond the world of physics. There are two crucial features to this complex of ideas. The first is that there's a universal causality operating throughout the physical world. This seems to open the possibility that human action is determined by prior physical causes. But morality depends upon the reality of human choice. Hence, the new physics seem to threaten morality and religion. The second is that the conception of the mind-body distinction was based roughly on the revived atomism of Lucretius. Matter was inert, solid particles. Mind was active, roughly what we encounter in self-reflection. Descartes pushes this distinction in his Meditations on First Philosophy in order to assert that there are two fundamental kinds of substance, mind and matter. The problem was that he had no way of explaining how they were or could be conceived to be in a relationship with each other. So how could immaterial mind cause a body to move? Subsequent responses from Princess Elizabeth, Gassendi, Berkeley, and the occasionalists explored and critiqued various versions of answers to this question. The traditional distinction of materialism from idealism was made in terms of these conceptions of mind and body. The problem was that physics has become the discipline that tells us what matter is, and the current understanding of the nature of matter given by quantum mechanics and relativity theory is nothing at all like the ancient atomists or the revived 17th and 18th century versions of Lucretius conceived it to be. Hence, the doctrines of materialism and idealism defined in terms of that ancient distinctions are essentially non-starters. Rather than the term materialism, I shall use the term naturalism for the doctrine that involves the claim that science gives us an account of the nature of matter which must be rationally accepted. The problem with the nature of with naturalism is it can be easily confused with the scientism which I discussed above. Let us call that scientism reductive naturalism to indicate its ambition to reduce all explanation to the level of physics. I want to distinguish that view from a non-reductive naturalism, which argues that such a reduction is not possible and that therefore leaves open the possibility that some forms of morality and religion are compatible with the acceptance of science. We can think of Thoreau as a part of that broad current of late 18th and 19th century thought identified as Romanticism. Like all the big, broad terms of intellectual history, this covers up lots of areas of disagreement among those identified as part of it. Some romantics, perhaps Blake among them, were anti-science. But in fact, most were tremendously interested in science. There's a relatively recent book by Richard Holmes, which explores, for the English-speaking world, the relationship between science and the major romantic figures. Thoreau was so interested, indeed, that it was a problem for Thoreau's scholarship as to how to account for his last decade or so of writing, which concentrated, he was still writing essays and things, but it concentrated on correct descriptions of natural plants, animals, conditions. He was especially interested in plants. And people have talked about it as a kind of shift to in almost inexplicable shift from the time of Walden. As we take this bird's eye view, and it clearly is from the history of human thought, from the point of evolutionary biology, it seems clear to me that the creatures that we are developed from the selective advantage of certain capacities. Our human systems of perception developed from the existence of organs in our ancestor species, and those in turn from the ancestors of the ancestors. The development of abstract thought, probably needing the development of language, has been the object of considerable speculation, but if one accepts the naturalistic, evolutionary, biological account of human origins, then some such account must be correct. The history of philosophy, dating in the European tradition to the ancient Greeks, is, in my view, the history of rationality. It's the tradition of understanding, trying to understand who we are, we human beings, and what our status in the world is. And let me just, as a brief kind of excursus, I'm not arguing that rationality is always an evolutionary advantage for the individual or for the species. Rationality got us atomic weapons, and atomic weapons may end our species. I mean, rationality produces modernity and anime and angst. Rationality is surely advantageous most of the time in the short run. If you're deciding whether to, step in front of a bus or not in front of a bus, then your knowledge of causality and all is in play. And of course, rationality itself is subject to rational reflection. The person in the philosophical tradition who has explored this issue most thoroughly is Nietzsche. In his introduction, written much later to The Birth of Tragedy, the revised introduction, he claims that the virtue of The Birth of Tragedy was that it raises the question, what is the value of science? What is the value of knowing? So this is also not the same as saying that the rationality is the fundamental mode of our human being in the world. In fact, I will argue the opposite, that it's not. But it does try and show what the relationship is between rationality and the set of beliefs that are produced by science. We're used to the notion that the historic religions conflict with the rational understanding of the world. But they were all rational structures of belief. If you were a European of the 12th century, of course the Catholic doctrine was what made sense. The crucial factor here is, as I said, the development of science. The development of science makes it the case that some historical claims of the historical religions can't be rationally accepted. You can opt for irrationality, as Kierkegaard did, for example. You can say, okay, I understand that, I agree with it, but they those things provided explanation of who we are, where we come from, how we should live, what we might hope for. For a Christian in Europe in the 12th century, Christianity was entirely rational. If we attempt, as many philosophers have, to naturalize epistemology, I won't try to explain or give an independent explanation of that, but roughly it's the idea is that it has to be understood in terms of who we are, and who we are is what is answered by evolutionary biology. Then inevitably one is driven to a broadly pragmatic position. By pragmatic, I don't mean a commitment to any of the developed pragmatisms, to Peirce or James or Dewey's version in American philosophical history. I mean the commitment to the idea that the basic term of epistemology is belief, and that knowledge is some version of rational belief. Belief is inevitably associated with our existence as active, doing beings in the world. This notion of belief starts as what we are prepared to act on. Sensory capacities produce belief. In this sense, belief is not the capacity to form a syntactically complete proposition that would express the belief. Belief can be attributed to any living thing. And if this offends your usage of belief, we can call, the state's proto-beliefs in lower, perhaps even single-celled creatures. Philosophers as disparate as Kierkegaard, Marx, Emerson, Nietzsche, Peirce, James, and in the 20th century, Heidegger and Wittgenstein emphasize the priority of our nature as active beings in the world over our knowing relationship to it. That's what's really crucial. Peirce, in The Fixation of Beliefs, talked about the superiority of the method of science to the methods of tenacity and authority by pointing to its self-correcting nature. Tenacity says something like, I've got a belief and I'm going to hold on to it. The authority says, somebody told me this and I believe it. But in those cases, there is no rational self-correcting nature to it. Science inevitably his claims are inevitably tentative, fallible in Peirce's talk. They're always open to revision. But this is exactly why science has become a criterion of the rational. Beliefs must be supported by evidence and open to reconsideration. Truth, rather than a property or of theories or beliefs, is the ideal outcome of the history of inquiry. So Thoreau went to Walden to, as he says, because I wanted to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die discovered that I had not lived. The essential facts of life included the necessities of food, shelter, and clothing. This is Thoreau's acknowledgement of what I have called naturalism. We must first understand that we are earthlings, creatures of the actual material world. I've made an extended comparison of various parts of Walden to texts of the young Marx written at roughly the same period as Thoreau's preparing to live and then living at Walden Pond. Marx wrote that he began from real premises of human history. Quote, they are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions under which they live, both those that they find already existing and those that they produce by their activity. The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Like Marx, Thoreau develops a critique of the newly developing industrial capitalist world, but from the point of view of the individual. Though he doesn't use the word alienation or estrangement, it's clear that he thinks that what the modern world produces is a situation in, quote, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. His suggested remedy is, unlike Marx, individual and not political. It is to practice philosophy as a way of life. In particular, this means a new kind of perfectionism that he saw in Emerson. And I need to say a few words about what I mean by perfectionism. It's an ancient strand in the traditions of moral philosophy. It's been associated with Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and Aquinas and Spinoza and Leibniz. For example, traditional perfectionism presupposed a divinely good structure of the cosmos and thought that the task for human beings was to come to know that structure and to realize the place of humanity in it. Perfecting one's own nature would be the goal, and what that state of perfection is would be determined by an understanding of the value-determining structure. In the 19th century, with its completely changed conception of the nature of the physical world and of the biological world, the dimension of moral life that Stanley Cavell characterizes as Emersonian perfection had a very different nature. Perhaps perfectionism is even a misnomer, since perfection is not a particular goal to be achieved, but rather a project for living towards a better self. It sets the task for the individual to realize one's potential, to advance in the direction of one's dreams. Quote from Thoreau, I learned this at least by an experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. Was Thoreau a transcendentalist? Well, I'm afraid that I have to give the philosopher's maddening answer. It depends on what you mean by transcendentalism. Certainly, if one goes by a list of those involved in the Transcendental Club in Concord, the answer would have to be yes. But I think we need a more philosophical criterion. I've previously discussed Kant's use of the term. The transcendent for Kant is beyond the bounds of possible knowledge. The transcendental can be known to exist, so you can use that term, but it's tricky. Emerson's case is much clearer than Thoreau's, though even his is a bit tricky. On the one hand, he welcomes the use of the term, though in his essay, The Transcendentalist, he uses the term to describe a younger generation than his own, perhaps having Thoreau in mind. In his essay, The Oversoul, he clearly opts for a way of speaking about reality that posits the two levels of existence, though as his poem Brahma shows, Hinduism rather than Kant may have influenced him more. And of course, Emerson refuses to be limited by a, quote, foolish consistency. One's past manner of speaking or writing may be rejected if one sees a present reason for doing so. Nevertheless, it does seem more than justified than not to give Emerson the classification of transcendentalist. Thoreau, on the other hand, seems for a variety of reasons to resist the term. Emerson tends to operate at a fairly high level of abstraction. Thoreau concentrates on this world. Even in Walden, where we have seen an underlying program at work in the text, this world, the world in which we operate as active, doing, desiring creatures dominates the text. When Thoreau decides to plant beans as a kind of metaphorical representation of a moral task, the beans refuse to cooperate and rot in the field. Moreover, I think that this feature of his writing has relevance to the issue in Thoreau's scholarship of explaining why he turned near the end of his life almost entirely to scientific observation. Thoreau had, for almost all of his adult life, explored the wisdom literature of all the different cultures that were becoming known to Europe and the West. He was a student of Native American cultures, again, insofar as they were becoming known. But I would classify his interest as anthropological. He wanted to understand how human beings had understood who they are. He found wisdom in the wisdom literature, but it was wisdom judged by the best current understanding of who and what we human beings are. Hence, the non-reductive form of his naturalism is critical. We don't understand who human beings are in terms of physics or chemistry or even biology because we are enculturated political animals. The attention to the ordinary of which I have written is a mark of this. To return to the nature of Thoreau's transcendentalism, one reason for resisting that term is that Thoreau used it in his journal to characterize a tendency in his work that he wanted to resist. If I were to characterize his kind of transcendentalism, I would classify it as something like the Hegelian kind, not obviously Hegel, but as a historical, epistemological distinction. There is always something more to be learned because we don't know it yet, we don't know what it is. And in fact, this fits very well both with pragmatism and Emersonian perfectionism. Now I want to conclude, well, more or less conclude with an account of the relationship of Thoreau and Darwin and then civil disobedience. I want to comment briefly on Thoreau's relationship to Darwin, because I think that relationship is crucial to understanding what I've called Thoreau's non-reductive naturalism. Darwin's published theory of evolution came with The Origin of Species in 1859. However, theories of evolution had been objects of discussion for a century or more, at least by that date. Indeed, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had offered one such theory. It was only when geology discovered deep time, roughly that the Earth was much older than any previous estimate, that some of the mysteries of the fossil record, for example, finding sea creatures, fossils in high mountains, began to be explicable. Thoreau had been an avid reader of Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle in 1851, and it greatly influenced him. There were still, of course, many biologists who resisted the idea of the transmutation of species. Indeed, Thoreau provided a record of his observation to one of them, Louis Agassiz at Harvard. Agassiz became the principal opponent of Darwin's Origin of Species in the United States. However, Thoreau had always had more sympathy for the developmentalist, as it was called then, the developmentalist position on species than what we might call the creationist view. He had been influenced by developmental theories that we might now think of as unsuccessful, but they had prepared him for Darwin's theory when it was published. Thoreau had a copy of Darwin's new book by early in 1860. He read it with fascination. He copied long extracts from it into his journal. He annotated his copy of it, and so on. So, unlike Thoreau, like Nietzsche, had his naturalism influenced by the new Darwinian view of the origin of species. Unlike Nietzsche, he had no opportunity to see Darwin's The Descent of Man, but one cannot doubt that he realized that human beings are animals whose species formed over a long period of time. I don't think that he found this a limitation on how we were to understand human freedom, morality, religion, culture. That's why I've called him a non-reductive naturalist. And I mean that he didn't think that there was a deterministic structure to this. So there was a reality to human culture which had to be understood and interpreted. If you think about the way that most people who claim to be religious in contemporary terms are religious, they do it by, as it were, reinterpreting what the historical religion has said. So that they don't take literally the book of Genesis. They understand it to be teaching some kind of lesson about the relationship of God to the universe or something like that. That's fine. That's not eliminated by science. But a literal reading of the book of Genesis is, in fact, in conflict with the scientific understanding. I've always thought that they should give political candidates in my country a test by asking them how old they think the Earth is, and we'll make it multiple choice. 3,000 years, 5,000 years, or 12 billion. I want now to turn to what may be Thoreau's most influential contribution to world political practice, the essay Civil Disobedience, originally entitled Resistance to Civil Government, said to influence such thinkers and actors as Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. Perhaps oddly, it's also been a factor in the argument for nonviolent resistance to political injustice. Certainly Gandhi and Martin Luther King adopted a kind of principled nonviolence in the political circumstances of their respective campaigns for Indian independence and for the end of Jim Crow and the aspiration for racial equality in the United States. However, though Thoreau's own act of resistance to civil government was peaceful and nonviolent, he later supported, for example, the violence of John Brown's attack on the institution of slavery. He was not a principled holder of a view of nonviolence. But I just want to emphasize one thing. To understand the setting of Thoreau's essay, one must understand certain aspects of United States history. The United States came into being because of a great compromise on the issue of slavery. That covered over and permitted the slave and the non-slave states to join together. It was a part of the original Constitution that slavery could not be discussed in the United States Congress for a generation. In the allocation of representatives by population, a single slave was allowed to account for 3/5 of a person, though of course no slave could vote. At the same time, a national mythology was put into place that celebrated the United States as the land of the free. And that contradiction lay at the heart of U.S. history. And it was only resolved in practice by the Civil War and the adoption of the Civil War amendments, numbers 13, 14, and 15. This didn't deal with gender inequality and the vast distance between American ideals as expressed in the Constitution and American practice. That remains a grave issue, obviously, even today. But those who wished for the abolition of slavery in the period between the establishment of the United States and the Civil War regarded the U.S. Constitution as an evil document. And so the problem that Thoreau is dealing with, and I think it's not a general theory of government, it's the particular problem of, given that you have an unjust system of government, how do you respond to it? What's the issue? The abolitionism was a minority sentiment, but it was especially strong in Massachusetts. Thoreau was, for obvious reasons, an abolitionist. He was working at a time when the South was enlisting the non-slave states in the service of slavery through the Fugitive Slave Law. The South used federal power to recover escaped slaves. It was also the time of the Mexican War, an egregious exercise of incipient U.S. imperialism. Against this background, Thoreau argued that not paying a tax bill that served to support the institution of slavery was the only available action to him that was in accord with his conscience. As I say, I don't regard this essay as providing a general theory of government. Such a theory would normally involve the adoption of a standard of justice as a necessary feature of a governmental structure, at least something like just enough, in order to generate an obligation to obey the laws that the government makes. In any democratic theory, and I'm thinking now of something like John Rawls' theory of justice, their question is, why should I commit myself to obedience of laws that I disagree with? Because there will be laws that I disagree with. And the answer is presumably something like, well, you know, I had my vote and I had my representatives and we lost, and so I'm committed to obeying the law. That was not the case at what we're talking about here. This was the case of the existence of a government that was completely unjust. So Thoreau argued that not paying a tax bill served to support the institution of slavery was the only available action that was in accord with his conscience. So this is as I say, something like it's necessary for a citizen to disagree with the law but recognize an obligation to obey it if this is a mostly just government, within limits, again. This was not Thoreau's position. He recognized that in regard to highway taxes or school taxes, he did have an obligation to his neighbors. But in regard to a government that he regarded as unjust, he had no such obligation, nor did he regard the argument from expediency, which he quotes from Paley as having any force that roughly, if you disobey the law, you're causing more problems than you're solving. Was Thoreau wrong? The abolitionists have long been criticized by historians as absolutists, but no, the abolitionists were right. The system of chattel slavery in the U.S. was a crime against humanity, one of the greatest in human history. So Thoreau was right. It was better for him to go to jail than to pay his tax. The real argument of Thoreau's essay is for the crucial primacy of one's own conscience, from one's own point of view in deciding what is the morally correct action. There's a traditional problem of an erring conscience. Conscience is not a perfect faculty with access to unquestionable truth, but that's a problem from a political point of view, not from the individual point of view. The individual point of view is the view, this is my conscience. So this connects the civil disobedience essay to the theme of Emersonian perfectionism that I discussed above. Those are the terms in which I would characterize Thoreau's philosophy. He was a kind of pragmatist in the general sense that I stated above, that he made belief and ultimately rational belief the basic term and counted knowledge as something that justified or warranted rational belief. That he was a non-reductive naturalist. His naturalism was located within a knowledge of the traditions of scientific inquiry, ancient and modern. He took the whole of human culture to be a source of knowledge about human beings, as well as clues to how science has developed. He accepted the Darwinian view of evolution as the framework for understanding who human beings are, but he did not accept the notion that all science could be reduced to physics. Hence, he had no problem with reconciling science and morality. He considered the problem of what obligation was owed to the unjust government that permitted slavery and conducted aggressive wars. His was the clearest expression of the idea that one's own conscience had to be honored above all. I once heard Stanley Cavell characterize Thoreau as the philosopher of adolescence. Certainly in Walden, he advocates for philosophy as a way of life, i.e. the notion that one's own life is a project that offers the opportunity to be what you want to be. Emerson was sometimes impatient with Thoreau for not taking up a fully adult life. He did not marry, not by his own choice. He was refused by the woman to whom he proposed, and he chose the role of himself of being the community gadfly. And that is what he can, I think, still be for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor, for this broad reconstruction of the background of Thoreau's thought.
I have a couple of minor requests for clarification. First, I'm afraid I didn't follow the contrast between the kind of situation envisaged by Rawls when he discusses allegiance to let's say, problematic order of things, in which the majority principle settles. The majority principle settles the issue of allegiance, and the situation in the American scene in the mid-19th century. After all, Webster or Polk or whoever had been democratically elected.
Right. Yeah, I think that
like D. Trump or Michel Temer.
Yeah. Rawls, I'll take up Rawls' account in A Theory of Justice and then try and classify Thoreau in terms of it. Rawls distinguishes between two or three different positions. One is the position which is inevitable in a just or mostly just society, and that means it has to have satisfied the principles of justice and so on, or roughly satisfied principles of justice, the ones that he gives. And then there's a problem, if again, you're talking about a sort of original position argument, but there's a problem from the point of view of the individual is, why should I agree to a system in which, when I sincerely believe to be the best role or the best policy or the best law is not accepted and something opposed to it. So I'm in the minority. That's a normal political process, and it has to be the case that if you have a mostly just society, it generates an obligation to obey laws, even though you would not have voted in favor of them. That's quite different from and Rawls then distinguishes two kinds of responses within a just society to those, and they sort of, both of these sound like Thoreauvian ones. One is conscientious refusal, as, for example, in the United States, when there was a draft, if you were a Jehovah's Witness, you had said, actually not that you would never fight, but that you would never fight for, an earthly earthly army.
Killing gooks in Vietnam.
Yes. And the other is civil disobedience, which in Rawls' term is an actual way in which you try and protest and to arouse the conscience of your fellow citizens that something has gone badly wrong, even though the society is relatively just. You have a just constitution. You've got a representative government. You've got all those things. All of that is quite different from where Thoreau was, because the acceptance of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and it wouldn't have come into existence otherwise. I mean, the compromise was the necessary step to bringing the United States into existence, but it was an act of evil. I mean, that it established an unjust society, that is, a society with slavery. And that Americans are used to, U.S. citizens are used to being raised on a kind of mythical version in which the history of the founding fathers is supposed to be, oh yeah, they were great and they figured it all out and they gave us this wonderful Constitution. But the big thing, and it was, and everybody kind of knew it at the time. It wasn't like this wasn't a mystery. Washington knew it. Jefferson knew it. That they sort of kicked the can. Said, yeah, slavery, it's bad, it's wrong, and we shouldn't have it, and so on. We'll let them figure it out in the future. Mm. Well, when the future actually was pretty bad, because there then arose in the South a very strong sort of biblical, philosophical, whatever one wanted to call it, justification of slavery. Slavery was right. It was the true and good system. So what had happened by the time of the Fugitive Slave Law and then Dred Scott was the Northerners had been, who were certainly racist in a different way from the way they were in the South, but the northern states had been sort of able to say, well, that's those people down there. They've got their system. Let them figure it out. But the South got very aggressive, and the whole issue then and the writing was on the wall that as the United States expanded and more states were being acquired, they had to make a decision about where will we permit slavery. And the idea of there being, the South had always had this huge electoral advantage. And the South it was crucial for them that slavery be preserved, and one of the things that happened was the Fugitive Slave Law and the Dred Scott decision, and that was what put Thoreau, I think, over the edge. He, I don't know, he wasn't an abolitionist in the way that William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist, but he just thought, I'm being enlisted in evil. I'm being told that my government, which from his point of view is the Massachusetts government, is forced to, and did in fact, send these fugitive slaves back. And that was just crazy.
That's slavery in Massachusetts.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't think that Thoreau. Sometimes people treat this as an essay on sort of government in general. But I think it's basically an essay on conscience, and he's just saying, look, we can't do this. And if you're doing it, if you're paying your tax, you're wrong. You're joining in. you're conspiring with the slave system.
Thank you.
Thank you for the paper. You used at some point the word earthlings to describe Thoreau's view of our way of being in the world. And that reminded me of a paper I read some time ago. I can't remember the name of the author, but the title of the paper was Three Worlds. And the idea was to distinguish three ways of seeing our relation to nature, human beings' relation to nature. And the author did that contrasting three movies. The first, three kinds of movies, let's say. But the first was the kind of documentary like David Attenborough's Planet Earth, I think it is there,
right.
Which is a kind of anthropomorphization of nature. It is a romanticization of nature. The idea that it is an Eden, it is so nice. If we only could go back there. So that was the more positive view of nature. And then, contrasting to that, Werner Herzog's movie called, I think it's Grizzly Bear. Do you know it?
I do.
It's about, for those who don't know, about a guy who tries to live with those those bears in nature, and he kind of succeeds at the beginning, but then at the end things go very wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't going to give the whole spoiler, but that happened. So Herzog's view is that we are not part of nature. Nature is there. We are human beings. I think his view is more or less, let's say, scientific in the sense that you were proposing. We are, in the sense of human beings are higher than nature. We are superior. We are rational. We don't. Anyway, we are separated from nature. We are not part of nature. That's the idea. And then, in the middle of those extreme views was a movie called Earthlings that I don't know, but by the description I read, the idea was to emphasize, let's look at the planet Earth from outside and see the relations and see that we are, in a sense, part of nature, but in another we are not. We interfere with nature. So there is a kind of doubleness. And this, Kelly was talking about that yesterday, this idea of a doubleness in our nature. Right. So, as you know, many people read Walden in that kind of romanticized view about nature, right. Going back to nature. I don't really like that Thoreau. And I think what the idea of going back to nature in Walden is more like a metaphor. Maybe it is one way of trying to rediscover our real needs and then to be reborn, to be born again. And that doesn't mean that we should necessarily leave our cities and go to nature to enjoy nature. The idea is that we should rethink our relation to the world, and I can do that here. I do not need to go to a cabin or something like that. So the question I would like to ask is, how do you understand that idea of earthling? What exactly is the meaning of that? And if that is what you mean by a non-reductive naturalism in Thoreau, and if you agree with that view, what's your view about that?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think that Thoreau in Walden falls well in the middle of the spectrum you've drawn. He does not think of himself as isolated. He doesn't report on everything, but he reports on friends that he sees and people who come by. He's going off. He's doing stuff. He did jobs. He took his laundry home to his mother to wash his clothes. So I mean, it's not heroic isolation that he was going for. He didn't go off into the woods to live by himself apart from human society and culture. He had a lot of books with him. He had, I think that the idea of earthling is simply the acknowledgement. The point that you make about, or the description that you give of the Herzog grizzly bear, that's not. Of course, we are different from other animals. We have special characteristics. May not be quite as special as we think, but pretty much. We have culture of a kind that seems to be different from any other species, so that we have an evolution of culture as well as biological evolution. But that's our nature. That's who we are. There's somewhere in that Cavell says something about human beings and finitude. And so he's saying, well, okay, as human beings, we are, of course, finite. And, of course, it's a natural feature of us as human beings to want to deny that we're finite. And indeed, that is, as it were, the natural feature. The interesting thing, at least in the sketch as I sort of laid it out here, is I take it to be the case that we now, in fact, know certain things. So if we know that the Earth has been around a long time, that we evolved from other species, that, all of those things, if we know all of that stuff, then we know something like what it is that we don't know. The things, and I'm not saying that we can't have beliefs that go beyond knowledge in this sort of pragmatist sense. I think we can. I mean, and in fact, I think my own view is that it's a natural projection of the natural capacities that we have to actually want to raise the further questions. When Kant says, as human beings, we are forced to raise questions that we cannot answer, I think that's right. We can't answer them, as it were, rationally, but we can think up answers, and we can give answers, and religion may be a way to do that. So nothing that I was saying would make such a religious belief is not necessarily irrational. I mean, if it's making particular factual claims that are false, okay, then that would be irrational. But if it's not, if it's just a way of understanding and interpreting everything, which science does not give us, then that's it. But earthling for me is just that, what I was saying, that we are active creatures in the world. What roughly what Heidegger and Wittgenstein agree on. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. Well, somehow I will come back to Paulo's point, but well, let's see if I will do this or not. But I use Kuhn's the structure of a scientific revolution to try to formulate a question. It's quite messy yet, but let's see if I can. Well, maybe your idea about roles is that, let's say that Rawls is talking in a time of normality.
Yeah.
And maybe Thoreau, in his mind at least, was talking in a time of pre-revolution, let's say, or something like that. If Thoreau, let's say that Thoreau knew Kuhn's ideas and agreed with this, his strategy to put into practice this revolution, let's say that is this minor revolution that is, well, it's very important, but is not to change completely the system, but to change at least part of the system. This point about slavery and about wars, that, well, the point is, Thoreau chooses the strategy of civil disobedience instead of, how can I say, instill his co-citizens to do a revolution. Okay. Well, my point is, first of all, this is, I try to from Paulo's points to try to see a picture and to see if you agree with this picture that I presented. But my question is, do you think that civil disobedience is a mild way to do a revolution? I never know if it's to make or to do a revolution. This is my problem with English. Or something ontologically different. Two questions. First of all, do you agree with the picture that I presented? This is in your answer to Paulo. And the second one, how do you understand similarities and difference in between civil disobedience and a revolution?
Okay. Let me take up the second question first. Civil disobedience, as Rawls discusses it, is a strategy that's again pursued roughly in a mostly just society, and it is something that he thinks can be tolerated up to a certain point, even if the majority think you're wrong in terms of what you're doing. But revolution is a quite different thing. Revolution is an attempt to overthrow the government, and that is completely, you can go back to Locke in a sense. You sort of have an oath to God. I mean, you say, I'm justified in a revolution, and if I'm not justified, then that's, But a revolution is not actually on the agenda in a way in the United States. It was kind of funny, because it's such a complicated historical situation. But the United States, there was not going to be a revolution. But there was going to be the Civil War, and the Civil War becomes a part of American mythology. That's why Lincoln's Gettysburg Address actually becomes the second founding document of the United States, because he formulated there the words that were so crucial in the war, which was, we've got this system. We said all men are created equal. What happens now? Can it survive? And he said later, something like if every crime of the slavery system has to be accounted for with the blood of the Americans who've committed the crime and those who've accepted the commission of the crime, that's that's just. That's the way it should. That's the way it should figure. So for Thoreau, I mean, I mentioned that he wrote those essays on John Brown, and he makes John Brown into basically Christ. John Brown is well, most historians don't accept that. They think John Brown was sort of crazy, and everything that he did was a complete waste and a total sideshow compared to. But from Thoreau's point of view, John Brown was completely justified. And he killed people. And that was justified because he was fighting the right fight. He was on the right side. So it's, there's sort of the details of, as I say, the reason I was mentioning this was because I think it sometimes is read as a kind of a theory of government or something like that Thoreau is sort of relying on. And it doesn't seem to me he's relying on a theory of government really at all. He's theorized a notion of conscience, and that's the issue. What does your conscience say to you? And the issue can't, as it were, be referred to somebody else's conscience. That is, you've got a conscience, and that's the thing that determines, what you should be doing. And his notion is that most of his northern neighbors agreed with him. The system's bad. We shouldn't have the fugitive slave law. Webster has betrayed us by accepting the compromises. All of that stuff. But also that they weren't going to do anything about it. I mean, eventually they would fight, but they wouldn't. They wouldn't actually join with him in refusing. Well, some did. Obviously, the abolitionists did, and it was a substantial movement. But so it's really addressed, I think, to his fellow Massachusetts citizens, the citizens of Concord, the citizens of Massachusetts, and he's saying to them, "Look, here's what you believe. You believe that slavery is wrong. You think that we shouldn't be, obeying the fugitive slave law, that we shouldn't be restoring slaves to their owners and so on." And there were the famous cases that took place in Boston. Do something about it. Do something. I mean, there's this system, and it's requires your participation, and up to you, up to you to somehow do something. People have made fun of Thoreau. He spent one night in jail. He was not a big deal. Somebody paid his fine. All of that. But in fact, it was a historically important occasion because he articulated something that had not really been articulated before certainly in America, which was this notion that if we really think that this is evil, then resist it. Do something to resist it. So anyway, that's sort of my reading.
Será que dá para eu falar em português e tu traduz para mim? Senão for me.
Oh.
Ah, tá bom.
Okay. Oops.
O meu questionamento seria no sentido de que a teoria do Rawls, com as condições de como é que eu vou dizer, de uma sociedade mais ou menos justa, dos cidadãos serem mais ou menos livres e iguais, e ainda de ter essa maioria que esteja em desacordo, então, com essas leis injustas, se ela não acabaria, talvez, restringindo o poder da desobediência civil, porque justamente ela está criando tantas condições de uma sociedade ideal que eu não sei se a gente tem isso, ou teve alguma vez, e ainda se muitas vezes é uma minoria que está se reivindicando contra essas leis injustas. Então, não sei se forma essa maioria muitas vezes. Então, eu queria que o senhor pudesse explicar um pouquinho mais, então, sobre a teoria do Rawls, por favor.
Okay. I think I got the question. In a theory of justice, which was his first major book, what he does is he tries to describe principles of justice and provide an argument about why they would, under certain kinds of circumstances, be chosen in a situation which he calls the original position. And the original position is, in turn, characterized by notions of fairness and so on. So I won't go into the details of that, but the principles of justice are that each person is entitled to the maximum of liberty that is compatible with a like liberty for all. And the second principle of justice is that inequalities are justified insofar as they work out roughly for the best possible position for the worst off. Those are the principles of justice. Then if those are principles of justice in terms of which he has a four-stage sequence roughly drawn from U.S. history, but original position, constitutional convention, legislative, and finally the executive actually carrying out the laws. If you have a system of government that is committed to and characterized by principles of justice, that still means that as you move along, there can be rational disagreement about what the right policies are to be carried out. And in some of those cases where there is rational disagreement, you will be in a minority. And the question is, why should I commit myself to obeying a law that I don't agree with? Well, there's a range of possible reasons for your disagreement. The question of whether you should build a bridge at this location or that location. There's arguments for both, and there's monetary arguments and convenience arguments and construction cost arguments and so on. And people have different criteria and match them differently and so on. So that's the kind of thing that normally a kind of specific question like that, people don't do it the way you thought they should, but it doesn't raise for you questions of conscience. It might if you felt that it was people had acted illegally or collusively or something dishonestly. The question of civil disobedience, there's sort of the two sides of civil disobedience. One is from the side of society, which is how much civil disobedience should a society tolerate. And tolerate means something a little bit different than accept or celebrate or whatever. It means something like how willing should the society be to, for example, mitigate the penalties for people who have done something like, say, protested what they think of as an unjust war, And this was particularly active in the 70s when Rawls published The Theory of Justice. So the society may decide that you don't really need to do the maximum punishment. You can sort of tolerate up to a certain point. You can make it symbolic. You can put people in jail for a day. You can do those kinds of things. From the point of view of an individual, civil disobedience is an act where you publicly disobey the law in order to try and establish your seriousness, your moral seriousness about what's going on. And the part of the strategy of that is that you accept the punishment. You accept the punishment that is there. You're trying to make a point, and part of the point is established by your seriousness, and part of your seriousness is established by your willingness to suffer punishment. So that's kind of the picture. What he calls conscientious refusal is different. That's where you just have, let us say, a religious belief or something like that, and you just won't do what the state says. You just think it, and you're not trying to persuade people or start a political movement or whatever. You're just not going to do it. That was the circumstances under which he was making those distinctions were particularly crucial. Then the United States had this draft and had the war in Vietnam, and it was there were both kinds of protests, both the protests of I mean, there were other things too. People went to Canada, but so when I was mentioning that kind of thing, I don't have it's every case is going to be different, and I don't have any I mean, the civil disobedience may be justified morally, it may not be justified morally, and so on. Same with conscientious refusal. I mean, maybe it's going to be correct, maybe it's not going to be correct. That's not the crucial issue. The crucial issue is sort of, in a sense, the crucial issue, well, it will be decided in a particular case, but it's that you have to sort of have in your theoretical vocabulary an understanding of the distinctions of what the phenomenon is. What is the thing that's happening? What is going on? So that was what Rawls was trying to provide. You're quite right that depending on the historical circumstances and the particular case and so on, civil disobedience may be stifled. It could be, or it may be encouraged. That's a sort of different set of issues. But the question of what civil disobedience is for Rawls, Thoreau's essay has the name civil disobedience, and it's kind of civil disobedience. It's kind of a combination of conscientious refusal and civil disobedience in Rawls' terms. But it's not this problem of civil disobedience as it occurs in sort of later political theory. It's that there's this actual historically set moment when slavery is in existence, and that more or less trumps everything else.
Okay, I have a further question of clarification. And I would like to invite you to go back to the concept of reductive naturalism, if only because, that's my worry, naturalism, as we all know, comes in all sorts of shapes and flavors, and ditto for reductionism. And I suppose it all hangs on what is being reduced to what. I was surprised to learn that Thoreau was acquainted with Darwin's work. And what puzzles me, in particular, with respect to Darwin, is that I wonder in which sense Darwin should be called a naturalist, and then in which sense he should be called, or if I am right, should not be called a reductionist. Let me resort to a spatial metaphor to describe that. I suppose reductionism works from top down, translating, so to speak, what goes on at the higher levels of the structure to what goes on the ground floor, which is supposed to be, well, all that really is going on.
Right.
Supervenience is the other side of the same coin. But now there's another proceeding, which I think is Darwin's proceeding, which works from bottom up, substituting, as Dennett says, cranes for skyhooks. A crane starts from bottom up, and we reach a more complex structure starting from what we had at the bottom. There's no reduction here. There is what one may call expansion. So Darwin moves from the ground level to the higher level, culture, language, tool using, and so on. And of course, Thoreau would not be familiar with that kind of work, which, if only because it was published much later by Darwin. But when you reach a book like The Expression of Emotion in Men and Animals, which is the founding, the seminal document of what we nowadays know after Konrad Lorenz or Nico Tinbergen's work as ethology, the comparative study of human and animal behavior. There's no reduction going on here. It goes in exactly the opposite direction in which reduction goes on. So I wonder what you meant in the end by reductionist naturalism.
Right. I think that the reading you're suggesting of Darwin, the sort of bottom-up understanding, can still be given two different interpretations.
Sure.
And one of them is that that there is, as it were, no emergence. So if there's no emergence, no I won't say supervenience because that seems sort of to degrade. So, but to talk about emergence, one of the things there's a very active discussion in evolutionary biology of the way in which evolution actually creates a new context for evolution at every stage, and unpredictable in
Sure.
principle. And that, if one accepts that kind of argument, then yes, that kind of a reading of Darwin, there's no reduction. There's as it were an explanation.
Yeah.
The explanation runs all the way up, but it isn't in terms of the activity of atoms or quarks or whatever.
Let me give one single example. Mammals, according to Darwin, are sentimental animals. And their sentimentality has survival value due to the long period of infancy, prolonged childhood, and the serious dependence, if they weren't sentimental animals, they would be extinguished. Well, it's unlike the case of the insect.
Right. I mean, it had to be the case. The reason that human beings developed was because they got big brains. They didn't get big brains because of that made language possible. They got big brains for some other reason. So the brains got bigger, and there was a selection for big brains. Big brains meant that a fetus had to be taken from the mother earlier. Couldn't go to what was full term. So you see lots of animals where the cow drops the calf, and the calf sort of shakes around a little bit and walks around and starts feeding the mother. Human beings aren't like that. The human infant is developed 100% helpless, completely helpless, and requires 100% attention. So whatever structure the society of an early humanoids was like, it had to have in some way those necessities of life. That is, they had to have a way of getting food, they had to have a family structure or a something structure, maybe not the nuclear family, maybe hunter-gatherers with, women raising children, whatever it was, that was there. That was natural. That has nothing to do with us. We still have helpless babies, but we've got all kinds of other options because of culturally and materially and technologically, we've developed all kinds of different ways of dealing with those issues. So we don't have to have a particular gender structure based on sexual difference. There's lots of different gender structures that can be accommodated. But gender structure is a universal. That is, every culture has a gender structure, and it's yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's my only point, that the commitment to the biological view of the human being is non-reductionist to the extent that you don't take it as determining what's there, because human beings do have this special difference, which is that they have culture, and the culture implies and permits cultural memory, institutional practices, all that stuff. So it's the reading that you were suggesting of the Darwin, that's fine, as long as it makes room for these emergent structures.
Bom, a gente encerra por aqui. Eu gostaria muitíssimo de agradecer a participação de todas as pessoas, não só que nos assistiram, como depois aqueles que vão nos assistir novamente, para que a gente possa retomar esses temas, a todos aqueles que submeteram trabalhos aqui, que se inscreveram, aos nossos convidados, que aqui fizeram a gentileza de aceitar o nosso convite, aos professores de outras universidades que nos prestigiaram aqui, e fica a nossa expectativa de que, eventualmente, esse trabalho árduo de organizar esse evento, de publicar essa edição especial da revista, possa motivar, quem sabe, para o futuro, que outros tenham a iniciativa de comemorar os 300 anos do Thoreau no próximo século. Muito obrigado a todos e uma salva de palmas. Encerramos com chave de ouro.